Thank you very much, Barra. Okay, so for the next 15 minutes, I'm going to talk you through the distributional impact of Budget 2020. And in order to do that, first we need to choose a benchmark. Against what are we going to compare Budget 2020? So we know that wages and prices are set to increase in 2020, so wages by 4.5%, prices by 1.4%. So if we were to just take Budget 2019 and apply the parameters of Budget 2019 to our forecasted 2020 population, we would have a situation where we see more higher rate taxpayers, more standard rate taxpayers, and low income people who are more dependent on benefits would be less well off compared to people who are experiencing this wage growth. So in order to abstract from this, we index Budget 2019 in line with wage growth in order to provide a neutral benchmark against which to assess Budget 2020. And the result of this is that when we assess the impact of Budget 2020 on the 2020 population, we're comparing it to a distribution of income that is similar to the 2019 distribution of income. So we're really isolating the effect of policy changes rather than mixing that up with things like wage growth. So importantly, this is not a policy prescription, okay? So we're not saying that governments should every year index tax and benefit policies in line with wage growth. To do this would be very costly, so it would have cost about 1.5 billion this year. And it takes money away from targeting measures. So if there are specific policies or groups of people in the population that need measures more targeted at them, it takes money away from that. As Barra has already kind of talked you through, this was a budget very much about expenditure as well. Indexing the tax benefit system in line with wage growth wouldn't have allowed this extra money for expenditure. So while this isn't a policy prescription, it is the best way to assess the impact of Budget 2020 on living standards in real terms. So what we do is compare Budget 2020 to an indexed 2019 budget, and both of these are applied to the forecasted 2020 population. Direct taxes and benefits are indexed in line with wage growth, while indirect taxes are indexed in line with price growth. Okay, and this is the picture we get. So what you're seeing here is the distribution of income, and okay, that doesn't work. Okay, so we have, here we have the population split into 10 equally sized groups, ranging from the lowest income to the highest income. On the y-axis there, you'll see the percentage change in disposable income compared to a wage index 2019 budget. And what you'll see is that there are losses across the board. So from the lowest decile to the highest decile, compared to a wage index budget 2019, budget 2020 results in income losses. And these range from about 1% at the very top of the distribution to 3% at the very bottom of the distribution. So you'll see that they're larger at the bottom of the distribution. So low-income households can expect to lose more in real terms than high-income households. And this is true both for direct tax and benefit measures and for indirect tax measures. And Barra has already talked you through how things like increasing carbon tax can disproportionately affect low-income households because fuel makes up a larger part of their bundle of goods and services. The same is true for excise duty on tobacco, and the same is also true for freezing tax and benefit parameters in cash terms. Failure to index these parameters results in low-income groups losing out by more than high-income groups because they are more dependent on benefits and less likely to be benefiting from wage increases. Okay, so that is for a wage index 2019 budget. What if we think that the wage indexation parameter is a bit noisy? So we're in the context of a no-deal Brexit, wage inflation may be lower than forecast next year. So here, this is compared to a 4.5% benchmark. What if it's lower than that? And given uncertainty around the level of wage growth, maybe on a year-to-year basis, particularly this year, it's more prudent to focus on keeping living standards constant in terms of purchasing power than in terms of disposable income. So to look at that, we also look at the effect of Budget 2020 on a price index 2019 budget. Okay, and what you'll see is essentially the losses are still forecast across the board, but they're a lot smaller, so in the region of 0.5%. Down at the bottom of the distribution, there are still slightly higher losses than at the top of the distribution, but the regressive pattern isn't quite so pronounced. So in reality, if we think that wage growth may not be quite as high as forecast for next year because of a no-deal Brexit, it's also true that price inflation is likely to be higher than forecast next year if there is a no-deal Brexit. So reality probably lies somewhere in between these two pictures, okay? What I'm going to show you in the rest of the presentation is based on a wage index assumption, okay? So you can think of the rest of the results that I'm going to show you as an upper bound of what we expect next year. What about the last number of budgets? So this government came into existence in early 2016. So what we've done here is show you the cumulative impact of the last 4 years of budget, so 2017 to 2020, compared to an index 2016 counterfactual. So what if the 2016 parameters had just been indexed in line with wage growth? How does budget 2020 stack up? And you'll see that the pattern is pretty similar. So we have losses across the board. They're higher than they are if we just compare to 2019. Excuse me, and the pattern is the same. There are higher losses at the bottom of the distribution compared to the top of the distribution. And the reason for this is essentially that over the last 4 years, tax and benefit thresholds have not kept pace with wage growth. And this impacts the bottom of the distribution more than the top of the distribution. And this narrative is played out when we look at the type of groups who are most impacted by Budget 2020 compared to a neutral benchmark. So in this, in the first column here, you'll see the effect of Budget 2020 compared to a wage index 2019 budget. And you'll see that the groups that are most affected are lone parents and pensioners. These are the groups most likely to be reliant on benefits. So they lose out by relatively more than singles or than working age couples. Looking at the period of 2016 to 2020, the pattern is the same. So lone parents and retired individuals and couples lose out by more than working age individuals and singles. So while it's true that the social welfare package this year did provide some targeted supports to low-income households, to households with children, it seems like given the expected wage growth next year, these measures didn't go far enough in order to protect these groups from income losses compared to other groups in society. And then what if we look at the expected impact of Budget 2020 on poverty rates? So here you're seeing our forecast for poverty in 2020 compared to what poverty would be if we had an index 2019 budget or an index 2016 budget. So you can see between the 2019 and 2020 policies, we see an increase in the at-risk of poverty rate, which is essentially the proportion of households who can be considered poor in disposable income terms. The poverty gap is also set to increase. The poverty gap measures the how poor people are, essentially. So how far they are below the poverty line, given that they are below the poverty line. So that's also set to increase compared to the neutral benchmark. And lastly, the at-risk of poverty rate in 2020 compared to the neutral benchmark is set to increase by about 1 percentage point up to 19.6%. So the targeting of the social welfare package again didn't go far enough here in order to ensure that poverty rates, particularly among children, are stable. Okay, so that's all been a bit glum. Bahara has alluded to the fact that this was a budget that was more about expenditure than about direct tax and welfare changes. And the thing about expenditure is that large increases in spending on things like health services can really benefit the living standards of households. But it's hard to put a value on that. So things like above average spending on health services, the introduction of the under-8 GP card, extra dental care for children, these are all going to affect households, but it's hard to put a monetary value per household on that we can compare to the effect of direct tax and welfare changes. However, one thing we can put a number on is the National Childcare Scheme. So what you're looking at here is the picture from 2016 to 2020. So we're comparing 2020 to a wage index 2016 budget, but we're also adding the expected effect of the National Childcare Scheme. So you can see that the National Childcare Scheme, which is up on the top there, can be expected to transfer approximately 1% of disposable income to those at the very bottom of the of the income distribution, and that kind of hovers between 0.25% and 0.5% as you move up the distribution and tapers off for the highest income groups. So the National Childcare Scheme, which is a largely means-tested policy for families who have children in registered childcare, does target the lowest income groups here, and does go some way to partially offset the reduction in living standards induced by essentially freezing tax and benefit thresholds, or the failure of tax and benefit thresholds to increase in line with wages. So it's a good example of how spending can also have an impact here. Okay, and then the last piece of good news is that Budget 2020 was gender neutral, largely. So the government, in its programme for government, committed to equality budgeting, which is a process which tries to minimise the gender differential of any budgetary action. And work we did here at the ESRI showed that the recessionary budgets in particular were distinctly not gender neutral, so women tended to lose out by more than men because of policies enacted in successive budgets. But after the recession, the tendency has been for budgets to be relatively gender neutral, and this tendency has continued this year. So I'm going to wrap up there. So there's no doubt that this is a challenging time for budgeting, given Brexit uncertainty. Indexation, which would keep the living standards of the population constant in terms of disposable income, is costly. It would have cost about 1.5 billion this year, and it results in less income for other capital and other expenditure. Because Budget 2020 wasn't indexed in line with wage growth, household disposable income can be expected to be lower in 2020 compared to an indexed 2019 budget. So if you think that wage indexation is the kind of correct measure that you want to look at, it's about 1.7% lower. If you're more inclined to keep purchasing power constant, it's about a 0.5% decrease. Because Budget 2020 does do a lot on the expenditure side, though, some of this, at least, is likely to be partly offset by extra spending. So health expenditure, which is quite hard to put a number on at the household level, but also the National Childcare Scheme, which can be expected to transfer about 1% of disposable income to those at the very bottom of the income distribution. And lastly, this was a gender neutral budget, which does continue the trend post-recession of budgets being gender neutral. Thank you very much.